It took my son 35 minutes to vote me out of the company I spent 30 years building. He called it modernizing. I called it betrayal. What he didn't know, as he smiled and shook the hands of the new board members, was that the patent for the secret recipe that funded his entire world was still in my name, locked safely away in a bank vault. My name is Margaret Collier. I am 70 years old. For more than half of my life, my hands have smelled of simmering tomatoes and secret spices. I am the woman who, alongside my late husband David, turned a recipe inherited from my father into a beloved brand that now sits in pantries all across the country. We started it in our garage with a second-hand bottling machine and more hope than sense. He was the dreamer. I was the doer. And until 10 minutes ago, I was the chairwoman of the company we built from nothing. I sat at the head of that long, polished mahogany table, a table I had chosen myself, and I watched him perform. He moved through his PowerPoint presentation with a smooth, practiced confidence, using words like synergy and brand realignment. He spoke of my leadership as the foundational era, a polite corporate term for the past. His wife, Laura, our head of marketing, sat beside him, nodding at all the right moments. They were pruning a dying branch, they said, to allow for new growth. I was the dying branch. As my own son outlined the reasons for my obsolescence, my mind wasn't in that cold, glass-walled room. It was back in my kitchen 30 years ago, the air thick with the rich, smoky scent of our barbecue sauce. David was beside me, laughing as he wiped a smudge from my cheek. We weren't building a brand then. We were building a life. Every bottle we sold held a piece of our story. It's a strange and painful thing to see a story you wrote with your own hands be erased by the people you wrote it for. As I share this with you, I wonder where you are in the world listening to my voice. It would bring me a bit of comfort to know where my story has landed today. If you have a moment, please leave a comment and consider subscribing to Granny Stories to hear how this all turns out. But the story Stephen was telling in that boardroom had no room for humble beginnings. It was only about endings, specifically mine. He concluded his presentation, the vote was called, and I watched as the new board members, all of them his allies, raised their hands. It was unanimous. I had been gracefully, efficiently, and publicly executed from the head of my own table. I didn't argue. I simply gathered my papers, stood up, and walked toward the door with a dignity they had not expected. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully modernized their company by cutting out its history, its heart, its founder. They had forgotten one small detail, a piece of paper filed away 20 years ago by my clever, cautious husband. They now owned the company, yes, but I still owned the formula. And a company that sells a famous secret sauce is worth absolutely nothing without the secret. I walked out of that cold glass building and into the bustling noise of a city that did not know or care that my world had just been neatly amputated. I didn't go home. Home was a place of memories, of warmth, of a past that now felt like a fiction. To go there now would be to surrender to the grief. And I was not in the mood for surrender. I was in the mood for strategy. I hailed a taxi, the first I'd taken in years, and gave the driver the address of my late husband's lawyer, a man I hadn't seen since we'd settled David's will. As the city slid by outside the taxi window, I thought of my son. He wasn't just a traitor. He was a fool. He was trading a 30-year legacy of authenticity, a brand built on a real story, for a generic, soulless corporate vision. He thought he was a businessman, but he had just made the worst business decision of his life. He had mistaken the heart of the company for a disposable part. Mr. Abernathy's office was in an old, quiet building with a creaking elevator and the comforting smell of floor polish and old paper. He was a man of David's generation, a man who understood that a handshake was a contract and a person's word was their bond. He was shocked to see me, of course, but he ushered me into his office, his face a mask of quiet concern. I did not cry. I did not tell him a long, sad story of a mother's heartbreak. I simply told him what had happened in the boardroom, the vote, the modernization, the dismissal. He listened patiently, his hands steepled. When I was finished, he sighed. "It's a brutal world, Margaret. These young people, they have no respect for what came before." "It's not about respect, Arthur," I said, leaning forward. "It's about ownership." And from my old leather briefcase, I produced the document. The patent. The one David and I had filed 20 years ago, a simple act of protection that had since been forgotten by everyone. Everyone but me. I laid it on his desk. He put on his reading glasses and began to read. I watched his expression change from weary sympathy to a slow dawning and deeply satisfying smile. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming. "My God, Margaret," he said, his voice a low chuckle. "This is ironclad. Your husband was a very, very smart man. It's a strange comfort, isn't it? To discover a shield you never knew you had left behind by someone who loved you enough to protect you from a future they could never have predicted. They don't just have a moral problem, Margaret." He continued, tapping the document. "They have a catastrophic legal one. They can't change a single ingredient. They can't produce another bottle. They can't do anything without your express written permission." I nodded. "Then I believe it is time we sent them a letter." We spent the next hour drafting it together. It was a cold, beautiful, and brutal document. It contained no emotion, only facts. It stated that I, Margaret Collier, was the sole and exclusive owner of the patent for the formula known as Collier's Finest Original Recipe. It informed them that their proposed changes constituted a breach of that patent and that any further production using the formula in any variation would be met with immediate legal action. It gave them 30 days. 30 days to recognize that the company they thought they had just stolen was nothing but an empty building and a hollow brand name. The real value, the secret, the story, that had just walked out the door with me. The letter would be sent by courier in the morning. I had been voted out of my own company. Now I was about to send my son an eviction notice for my own recipe. The day after my visit to the lawyer, I did not sit by the phone. I did not pace my living room. I spent the morning in my garden. I pruned the roses, my movements slow and deliberate, the sharp snip of the shears, a satisfying sound in the quiet air. I had made my move. The letter I knew would be delivered by courier to my son's office at exactly 10 a.m. I did not feel anxious. I felt a profound and unfamiliar sense of calm. I had spent years reacting to the whims and ambitions of others. Now, for the first time, they would have to react to me. The call came at 4:30 in the afternoon. It was Stephen. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, just to let the silence sit for a moment. His voice was not the smooth, confident tone of the CEO from the boardroom. It was a strangled, furious bark. He shouted about betrayal, about how I was trying to blackmail my own family, my own company. He asked if I had lost my mind. I let him vent. I listened to the storm of his accusations, his disbelief, his wounded pride. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was quiet, even, and utterly devoid of the emotion he was so desperately trying to provoke. "It's not blackmail, Stephen," I said, as if explaining a simple recipe. "It's a standard patent infringement notice. I am merely protecting my intellectual property, a concept I'm sure you discussed in business school." I could hear his wife Laura in the background, her voice a high, panicked whisper. "What does she want, Stephen? Money? Just give her the money." He ignored her. "You can't do this, Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You'll destroy the company. Our company." "My company," I corrected him gently. "The one I founded in my kitchen. The one built on my father's recipe. A recipe which it turns out is a legally protected asset." My asset. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The fury had been extinguished, replaced by the dawning cold horror of a man who has just realized he has been playing chess against a grandmaster and has mistaken her for a novice. He had been so focused on his brilliant corporate coup that he had never once thought to check the ownership of the crown jewels. It is a strange and difficult thing to have to treat your own child like a business rival. But have you ever found that sometimes a little bit of formality is the only language that can truly command respect? "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice small and defeated. I did not give him a list of my emotional grievances. I did not ask for an apology. I kept my response within the new professional framework I had established. "That is a matter for our lawyers to discuss." "Stephen," I said, "Mr. Abernathy, my legal counsel will be in touch with your corporate attorney to schedule a formal meeting. We can discuss potential licensing terms then." I hung up the phone. The shouting had stopped. The panic was now his to manage, not mine. I had not asked for a seat back at the table. I had not demanded he see my value. I had simply reminded him who owned the table, the chairs, and the very recipe he was trying to sell. The 30 days had begun to count down, and for the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding the clock. My lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, kept me informed of the fallout. The news from the company was, as he put it, predictably chaotic. My letter had landed like a bomb in their shiny, glass-walled headquarters. The big contract they were about to sign with a national grocery chain was put on indefinite hold. Production of our signature sauce had to be halted immediately. Rumors were beginning to fly through the industry. Collier's Finest was in trouble, and no one knew why. I felt a grim satisfaction. They had wanted to erase my history with the company. Instead, they had managed to jeopardize its entire future in less than a week. I did not hear from my son, Stephen, directly. His anger, I suspect, had been replaced by a frantic, terrified scramble to figure a way out of the legal trap he had set for himself. But I did hear from his wife, Laura. She showed up at my front door on a Thursday afternoon unannounced. It was the first time she had ever come to my home alone. She was not her usual polished self. Her smile was strained, her eyes were tired. She came bearing a peace offering, an expensive orchid from the florist downtown. She had come to negotiate. She spoke of the children, of the family's reputation, of the dream we had all shared. She tried to paint Stephen as an ambitious, misguided man who had simply gone too far. She was attempting to appeal to me, mother, to mother woman, to woman, hoping to find a crack in my resolve. She asked me to bypass the lawyers, to just talk things out like we used to. Have you ever had to listen to someone you know is being dishonest, a performance so carefully crafted that you almost admire the artistry of it, even as you see right through it? I listened patiently until she was finished. Then I told her calmly that the time for talking things out was over. The moment they had voted me out of my own company, they had transformed our relationship from a family matter into a business one. And in business, you communicate through your lawyers. I told her that all future proposals should be directed to Mr. Abernathy. She left her orchid sitting on my coffee table like a beautiful silent bribe. That evening I received a short, handwritten letter in the mail. It was from my granddaughter, Anna. Grandma, it read in her neat, careful script. Mommy and Daddy are fighting a lot. The house feels sad. I miss the smell of your sauce cooking on the stove. Her simple, honest words were a painful reminder of the innocent collateral damage in this war. But they also strengthened my resolve. I was not just fighting for myself and my own legacy. I was fighting for a future where my granddaughter might one day run a company built on integrity, not just ambition. Laura had come to my home appealing to the soft-hearted mother-in-law she thought she knew. But that woman was no longer taking appointments. She had come asking me to bypass my lawyer to make a deal based on old loyalties and shared history. She didn't understand. My lawyer was now the only part of our shared history that I could fully trust. I had the patent. I had the power. And I was learning with a quiet and steady resolve how to use them both. The first formal meeting was scheduled at my lawyer's office, not theirs. It was a small but significant detail, a quiet declaration of who now held the power. I chose to arrive early to be seated at the head of the conference table when they walked in. I wanted them to enter my space to play by my rules. They arrived with their lawyer looking diminished and tired. My son Stephen would not meet my eyes. Laura's polished, confident facade had been replaced by a tense, weary guardedness. The arrogance of the boardroom coup was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a business on the verge of collapse. Their lawyer, a man with a practiced, sympathetic smile, did most of the talking. He spoke of a regrettable family misunderstanding. He then made their offer a generous one-time payment to buy the patent from me outright. They wanted to write a large check to sever the connection and to own my father's recipe free and clear. It was an offer of money, a final attempt to buy my silence and my absence. I listened politely until he was finished. Then I slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was not a number. It was a list of my terms. I am not interested in being bought out, gentlemen. I said, my voice calm and clear. The patent is not for sale. It can, however, be licensed. I laid out my non-negotiable conditions. First, the company Collier's Finest would license the original recipe from me for a royalty of 10% of the net profits annually. Second, I was to be reinstated to the board not as chairwoman, but with a newly created permanent seat as founder and legacy advisor, with full veto power over any and all changes to the original recipe. And third, my granddaughter Anna was to be hired as a paid summer intern, working directly with me so that I could personally teach her the history, the craft, and the soul of the business I had built. I was not just reclaiming my place. I was establishing my own succession plan. It is one of life's saddest lessons, isn't it? To realize that you must put a formal contract in place to guarantee the respect you should have been given freely as a mother. They were stunned into silence. They had come to the meeting with a checkbook hoping to solve a problem. They had not expected me to hand them a new set of rules for their entire future. Their lawyer read my terms, his professional mask slipping for just a moment as he raised his eyebrows. He looked at Stephen and Laura, who were staring at me as if I were a stranger they had never truly met. Their lawyer said they would need time to consider my terms. I told him to take all the time they needed. I had waited 30 years to be truly seen in that company. I could certainly wait another week. I stood up, thanked them for their time, and walked out of that office, leaving them to sit in the heavy, suffocating silence of their own miscalculation. They had tried to take my company from me. In return, I was offering them a chance to save it, but the price was steep. The price was their pride. They had wanted to erase my past with the company. I had just made myself and my granddaughter its undeniable future. Their surrender came not with a phone call, but through a formal, crisply worded email from their lawyer to mine. They accepted all of my terms. There was no negotiation. There was no further argument. Reading the email, I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of victory. I only felt a quiet, somber sense of order being restored. The battle was over. Now the difficult and necessary work of rebuilding had to begin. My first day back at the company was a strange and quiet affair. I was no longer the chairwoman to be greeted with a mixture of deference and fear. I was the founder advisor, a title that felt both ancient and new. They had given me a small, quiet office, not on the executive floor, but right next to the development kitchen, the very room where the magic had first happened. It was a perfect relocation. I had been moved from the head of the company back to its heart. My son Stephen and his wife Laura were polite, distant, and visibly uncomfortable. They were learning the new shape of power, and it did not sit easily with them. But my purpose that day was not them. It was Anna. My granddaughter arrived at 1 o'clock, her face a mixture of nervousness and excitement. I did not begin her internship with spreadsheets or market analysis. I began with a story. I took her into the kitchen, and from my briefcase I unwrapped my father's old leather-bound recipe book. I showed her his spidery, faded handwriting, the notes in the margins, the small stains of molasses and spice that were a map of his own journey. I taught her that our sauce was not a product. It was a history. I explained why we used a specific type of smoked paprika, telling her the story of the Hungarian farmer my father had met after the war. I showed her how to char the onions just as he had taught me to bring out a sweetness that sugar alone could never replicate. I was not teaching her a recipe. I was passing down a legacy. Have you ever had the chance to pass down a piece of your own history to a younger generation? It is a powerful and humbling feeling to see your past take root in the fresh, fertile soil of their future. As we worked, I saw a new light in Anna's eyes. She was not just my granddaughter. She was a collier. She had the same patient hands, the same intuitive understanding of flavor that had been in our family for generations. At the end of our session, as she and I were cleaning the large copper pot, Stephen appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, just watching us. The kitchen was filled with the rich, familiar scent of the original sauce, a smell that had been absent from that building for months. "It smells," he said, his voice quiet and a little hoarse the way it's supposed to. It was the closest he had come to an apology. It was an admission that his modernization had been a mistake. I did not gloat. I simply took a clean-tasting spoon, dipped it into the warm, dark sauce, and held it out to him. He hesitated for a second, then took it. He tasted it, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a memory perhaps of a time before he had become a CEO, when he was just a boy in a kitchen that smelled like home. I left the office that evening, leaving the scent of simmering tomatoes and my granddaughter's thoughtful questions behind me. My victory was not in the legal contract that now protected me, or in the royalty check that would soon arrive. The victory was in Anna's hands, stained with paprika and brown sugar. They had tried to modernize the company by removing its soul. I had saved it by ensuring its soul was passed on. And that was the only profit margin that had ever truly mattered. The months that followed were a lesson in the slow, careful art of rebuilding. I did not return to the company as a queen returning to her throne. I returned as a gardener tending to a patch of earth that had been neglected. My office remained the small, quiet room next to the kitchen. My official role was founder advisor, but my true job was that of a historian, a teacher, and a guardian. Twice a week, I would work with my granddaughter, Anna. I passed down to her, not just the secret ingredients of our sauce, but the secret stories behind them. She learned not just how to run a business, but how to lead a legacy. The company with its soul restored began to heal. The big grocery contract was signed this time with a new clause that guaranteed the use of the original high-quality ingredients. My son, Stephen, and I found a new way of being with each other. The old, easy familiarity was gone, replaced by a more formal, more profound respect. He started asking for my opinion not as a formality, but because he had finally learned to value my wisdom. He was learning to be a better leader and a better son. Looking at an old photograph of me and my late husband David covered in flour in our first kitchen, I suppose my life has become one of those unlikely grandma true stories. The kind where the quiet woman in the apron, the one everyone took for granted, turns out to have been the secret ingredient all along. But what I've learned is that the most powerful grandma true stories aren't about the fight itself. They're about what you choose to build after the fighting is done. It's a lesson I see echoed in so many of the tales shared on Granny Stories. We, the quiet matriarchs, build things with our hands and our hearts. And then we must fight to keep that heart from being turned into just another commodity. It's a constant battle to protect what is authentic in a world that so often values what is profitable, isn't it? My legacy will not be a stock price or market share. It will be in Anna's capable hands, in the rich, dark sauce she now knows how to create, by feel, not just by measurement. And perhaps it will be in a son who is slowly learning that the best grandma true stories are about passing down a heritage, not just liquidating an asset. The company is safe now. Its heart is beating strong again. And my own heart, after a long and difficult season, is finally at peace. Thank you for being here for my story. If my journey of protecting a family legacy has stirred a memory or a thought in you, I would be so honored if you would share your feelings or a piece of your own story in the comments below. Every story shared adds another layer to our own rich history. If you know someone who is fighting to protect their own secret recipe in life, please feel free to share this with them and to join our wonderful family of storytellers. Please consider subscribing to Granny Stories. Thank you for listening.